Hi everybody, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities, and gender equality. You might have noticed that for the last 2 episodes, the podcast has started with some different music. The song Now Is Time, performed by Chaps Choir and written by Dom Stitchbury, who we interviewed in episode 49. So a big thank you to them for letting us use this beautiful and very relevant piece.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm now back from travelling around Spain. Such an amazing country, really. Last year, I think it had the highest growth amongst major economies. Centre-left government has recognised the benefits of migration, unbelievably, and boosted public spending, with very positive results. I mean, who knows whether they'll be able to hold on to that approach, but they're certainly a progressive beacon in these dark times.
Yeah, absolutely, Sandy. Something else I'd like to acknowledge as well is that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation.
Yeah, that's something that you've been saying since you moved to Australia, Stephen. Do you want to just explain why you would say that?
Yeah, so it's actually a really important kind of act of recognition to First Nations people here, which I suppose helps them to feel welcome as part of the conversation by acknowledging that the lands which we're living and working on here, that they have been cared for by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years, and actually, they were stolen from them by our forebears, by the British, and that they've never actually, First Nations people here have never ceded their sovereignty of these lands. So I guess it's a way of kind of paying respect to that and acknowledging the kind of the ongoing, I suppose, nature of colonialism here in Australia and more widely as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Britain has still to come to terms to some extent with the impact of its earlier colonisation of many parts of the globe. And I always feel that I have to sort of apologise right at the start in conversations like this, and I think I've done it repeatedly on the podcast, but so be it. Anyway, it's good that we're talking about these things too today, because we've got an Australian with us on the podcast, Tarang Chawla. And Tarang is a speaker, writer and activist, and he's the co-founder of Not One More Niki, which is a grassroots non-profit organisation working to end men's violence against women. And it was named in memory of his younger sister, Nikita, who was murdered by her partner in 2015. Among other things, he's also a commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission and a sessional academic at Monash University.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Tarang, for joining us. It's a real privilege to have you on the podcast as perhaps, one of the most well-known and respected male voices speaking out about violence against women in Australia.
No, it's an absolute privilege for me to be joining you both on this podcast. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and it's just lovely to be able to sit down and have this conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, just to start off with, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing around ending men's violence against women through Not One More Niki and more broadly, and perhaps also a bit about the journey that led you into this work?
Yeah, so Sandy touched on, I suppose, my why I started this work. It was a very public event, which was the murder of my younger sister a little over 10 years ago now. She was 23 at the time of her murder, and the advocacy work and Not One More Niki grew from that, or it was born from that moment of tragedy. And there were a few things, I suppose, that culminated in why I chose to be as vocal or as active as I am now. One was, or primarily, I suppose, was the fact that my sister Nikki, like many other victims of men's violence in the most serious cases of homicide, had her voice permanently silenced. She couldn't speak for herself. And we went through a criminal justice system that at the time was particularly weighted in favour of perpetrators against victim survivors and their families. And having a legal background and legal training and that knowledge, I thought, what better situation to put it to some kind of use than here and now? Right. And as I met with so many victim survivors across the country, primarily women, I saw the way that the legal system often silenced them or made things much more cumbersome or difficult or traumatic for them to be able to seek justice and then, by extension, to move forward with their life through recovery and healing, etc. And so that was sort of the very beginning of that. And over time, I started to, as I became more aware of the levels and sheer reality of gender inequality in Australian society and its intersections with class and race and other aspects, particularly coming from a migrant South Asian Indian identity and growing up as a brown-skinned person in Australia, there were all of these intersections that fascinated me. And so the work that we do is now geared towards supporting particularly underprivileged communities from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and from culturally and racially marginalized backgrounds about understanding what gender equality is, about understanding what patriarchal societies are, why certain societies have a propensity towards men's violence against women, and what the role that men play in challenging that culture or those attitudes actually is, in a way that tries to be as inclusive as possible and gives men and boys a space to belong rather than gives them yet another cause for resistance or feeling that they are under attack, which is something that I think a lot of men, rightly or wrongly, continue to feel in contemporary Western society, that their very identity or the core nature of what makes them human is under attack.
I mean, one thing you've spoken about powerfully is how the media portrays the issue of domestic abuse, and perhaps how it does portray men who have perpetrated domestic abuse, including men who have murdered their partners or children. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about that? Like, what is it that's kind of problematic about how the media is kind of framing this? And is there anything you'd like to see, I suppose, media organisations doing differently in this area?
I think I wouldn't even know where to start or where to end. It's sort of it's one of those questions where I have to respond in kind by saying, how long do we have? I think we wouldn't be in a society in the broad Western society, to make a generalization, or other parts of the world where the culture that enables men's rates of domestic abuse and violence against women wouldn't exist if not for a media that absolves men, en masse of any accountability for their actions, I suppose. And there are particular caveats to that. We don't treat all forms of men's violence the same when it's, in the way that we report on men who use violence. So, for example, men of color who use violence, in furtherance of political or other objectives, through acts of terrorism, are often put together with other people of their, chosen faith, or typecast in a particular way that others, particularly men from Anglo backgrounds, or and particularly Anglo backgrounds who are also well-to-do. Not someone from a lower socioeconomic group, but someone from the middle class. If an Anglo male from the middle class commits an act of domestic abuse or family violence, when it is reported on, it's often reported on in a way that makes his actions an aberration, right? It makes it the one minor misstep in what was otherwise a quite illustrious life or a high-achieving life. And especially in the Australian context when that person is very good at sport. I've been following recently there's a man by the name of Ben Cousins, a former Australian footballer who has been convicted of multiple domestic violence offences, drug charges, other substance abuse issues in the past. He's spent time incarcerated as well. And he now has, quite a privileged role in the Australian sports media. And what's fascinating is that his redemption arc has involved him speaking about how he has overcome addiction, which is, I think, a great thing to be discussed. His redemption arc has involved him talking about his issues with drugs, other things. But at no point has the fact that he caused grave physical harm to a number of female partners been addressed. It's sort of just been swept under the rug. In that sort of quintessential she'll be right way of dealing with things in Australia. That's just not spoken about. And I think one of the things that I would love to see a shift of in terms of how the media reports on men's violence is to actually show the stories of rehabilitation or accountability and actually discuss them. Because we can't have a society where all men who've used violence are outcast as pariahs. And yet the ones who do find a way to redeem themselves, it's not spoken about. Because somewhere along that journey, there are people who've suffered, primarily women and children, who've suffered irreparable harm. and yet we seem not to want to talk about it. Or when I say we, the media seems not to want to speak about it. So they'll rely on certain reinforcing of certain power structures and class structures or ethno-cultural structures in how they report on men's violence. And it's one of those things that once you start becoming more observant of it, you can't miss it, right? So if I have conversations, particularly with women about this issue, they're at their wits' end. Often they're fed up. You know, they say I can't even read the news when it comes to this issue because of how unfortunate the media reporting is.
Just going back to your story for a moment, I think it illustrates quite a horrendous demonstration of the sort of ripple effects that men's violence has, not only on the victims themselves, but also on a wider circle of people around them. And that isn't really something we talk about so much. I mean, is there any way in which you think men could start to instigate conversations more about this with each other?
Oh, what a fantastic question. And the premise of that is something that I hold dear, that the ripple effects of men's violence are felt by all members of the community and society. And so in my immediate case, it is my biological sister. We share half the same thereabouts of DNA. We grew up very close, and one day she was permanently erased. And so the ripple effects are felt by her immediate family, by her extended family, and by her community and friends. And I think that I've said publicly before that we all bear the loss when it comes to men's violence against women, because the unfulfilled potential of these individuals is taken from them. All right. And I think one of the ways that we can more meaningfully engage boys and men in these conversations is to one approach, which I'd love to see more of, which I think gets down to this idea of conversations around what it means to be a man and opening up more avenues for manhood and masculinities, is allowing men to be more in touch with their emotions. So, for example, we don't need to know someone who is an immediate victim of men's violence to experience anger or betrayal or shock or grief or denial or all complicated range of emotions that occur when something tragic happens. We have life experiences as men that we can use to build that empathy, to have that understanding of the emotions. And I think the benefit of that is twofold. One is that we are allowing men space to have conversations around men's violence that does not necessarily have to begin and end with men's violence, right? And the other aspect of that is that we are enabling them to feel emotions, which is consistently what we encourage men to do. We encourage men to have a greater gamut of the human experience, that there are more experiences to being masculine than simply rage and shame or guilt. Right. And so I think that is one thing I'd love to see, because the ripple effects are there, they're pertinent, they're profound. And without talking about them, without actually understanding that men's violence goes so much broader than just the primary victim, we unfortunately aren't able to have the collectivist community response that we'd like. It's almost like they're at odds with each other. We talk about the collective responsibility to end men's violence against women, and yet we look at the victims as being singular women rather than it being part of a broader pattern of misogyny and entitlement and aggressive behavior by men.
Right. And presumably you would think that some of the sort of dominant notions, nostrums of masculinity are actually hindering responses, so being strong, stoical, whatever. This is part of the issue.
Absolutely. And one of my current gripes, Sandy, if I may, is the sort of misrepresentation of stoicism that we've seen in 21st century. It's often used by I suppose, podcasters in the manosphere, right, who will talk about being stoic as an idea of being a man. Yet the Stoics didn't, in their time, reject any and all emotion. They weren't saying that men have to not feel emotion, or that any person of any gender doesn't feel emotion. It was rather how one responds to external stimuli, right? It was more a way of processing, right? External stimuli, and how to deal with complicated emotions in life. Uh, and whether that manifests in a particular way on the outside, it didn't at any point, reject entirely that one does not feel immensely, or one does not, love immensely, or one does not have anger, or all mix of emotions. And I think it's being, unfortunately, misappropriated by some to convey this idea of masculinity that ultimately, I feel, and I'm sure that you both agree, is quite damaging to men. Like if we take stock of some of the more recent statistics in Australia, the men who subscribe to these ideas of masculinity that fit into that idea, the man box, they have terrible health outcomes, irrespective of their relationships with other people. They have terrible health outcomes. They're eight times more likely to have suicidal ideation on a frequent basis. Right. And that's a 2024 statistic from the Jesuit Social Services. It's forget anyone else. You're going to have a shitty relationship with yourself if you have these ideas of what being a man is.
I suppose connected to that, Tarang, you have mentioned in a recent Instagram post that you also have experienced sexual abuse yourself as a child. So, of course, this must be an incredibly sensitive, personal issue. But do you want to say any more about that? What prompted you to start talking about it and what impact it's had on your life?
Well, for the longest time, I didn't talk about it. And I still don't know what specifically triggered the idea that I should disclose it publicly. A lot of people, sadly, a lot of boys grow up to become men who have dealt with this as a child, right? Or experienced this as a child, I should say. And so I wasn't, I'm still not entirely sure why I felt compelled to do it. I suppose at the time there was a case of me feeling as though there aren't many people of color, or men of color in particular, speaking about this issue. It happens in those communities. It exists, it is real, and yet very few of us are talking about it. And so I thought, stuff it. I should, I felt a responsibility. I had done a lot of the work, or of speaking to professionals, of sort of coming to terms with it, of understanding that it wasn't my fault, etc., of doing all of those things. And when I reached a point, I suppose, where I felt able to separate myself somewhat from the deep personal trauma, to be able to talk about it in a sense that, yes, this happened to me, but it does not define me in any way. I felt ready, I suppose, to speak about it publicly. And it was overwhelming, Stephen and Sandy. It was so overwhelming to be inundated with messages from individuals who had experienced similar things, or who weren't sure if they had perhaps experienced something similar. Because child, sexual abuse is so often misunderstood, not spoken about. Grooming behaviors in particular are not understood. And often the myths pervade of stranger danger, rather than the idea that it could happen, at the hands of someone close to the nuclear family unit, so to speak. So there's so much misinformation, perhaps more misinformation about childhood sexual abuse than there is about domestic abuse and family violence. Not that it's a competition by any means, but it was quite startling to see the level of misinformation and at times disinformation. And in its own way, it was quite empowering, I suppose, and subverting some ideas of traditional, hegemonic masculinity, to actually speak out and say, yes, this happened to me, and to be vulnerable in that way, in a public platform, a social media platform. And of course, there's trolls online, and there were people who wrote some despicable things and horrible things, but there was overwhelmingly just goodwill, and also quite confrontingly, a lot more people who'd been directly impacted than I'd ever imagined.
Well, I'm so sorry about that, but also, I think that thank you for what you've done, because I'm sure that that's helped other people, feel less alone, and to feel able perhaps to talk about it more themselves.
I hope so. Thank you. It's kind of you to say, but I hope so, because I think I think we see, particularly, I imagine the UK is quite similar in this respect to Australia. Uh, but there is such, particularly when it comes to institutional cases of child sexual abuse, there is the cover-ups and rallying around those who are perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, rather than support for the victim survivors. And what is most confronting is particularly seeing the loss of potential, or the loss of a life well lived by men who grow to their old age, who experience despicable things and acts of betrayal as a child. And those little boys could grow to become men, who could do things we could only dream of, and yet something was stolen from them at a very tender age. And I think it is a very disgusting thing, and it's something that I encourage more men, to the extent that they feel comfortable, to speak out about it, because the shame does not lie with the victims of this. It certainly should lie with the perpetrators and those who cover up their actions, because I think that when we open up, when we are vulnerable in these ways, we create a world where there is greater gender equality, and there are better outcomes, I suppose, for the majority of men.
I'm wondering how you've dealt with the pressure of, the things that you've experienced, let alone also being something of a spokesperson as well in the public domain. How's that been for you, and how do you deal with that?
I've got great support networks. I've got people around me who are very loving. My immediate family is tremendous. But I will say there are times where advocacy, and I've spoken to other advocates. I've got some friends who are wonderful advocates, and we sometimes speak about the loneliness of advocacy. Right? It's particularly, having been vocal for a bit over a decade now, the sort of as successive generations are using social media in more savvy ways. One of the tricky things is that information spreads so fast, right? And it's the difficulty on being a spokesperson for these issues is the constant tussle between, do you want to be the first person in a 24/7 news media cycle, or do you want to be the person who's considered and thought about it? Because you can't be both. You can't possibly be across everything. It's not humanly possible. Right. And so the difficulty there lies in making a choice. And sometimes one of the things I struggle with, perhaps, is the unseen criticism which comes from people saying, why aren't you talking about XYZ issue? Or why aren't you doing more in this? And sometimes it's tricky because you may actually be doing that stuff. Right. And yet you haven't written about it publicly. You haven't spoken about it publicly. Sometimes for no reason other than it's grim. The grim reality of some of these issues is that you don't want to talk about them very much, right? And so there's this sort of balancing act. But I suppose the only way I've done it for so long is that I've got great people around me. And I suppose in some way the memory of my sister sustains me. Nikki was a tremendously loving and giving individual, and she was very, very affectionate towards me. And to her whole family, to all of us. And so I suppose that in some way drives me. And then also meeting many, many victim survivors. You draw strength from the fact that what is being done to so many people is so despicable, and yet they find a way through. Right? And so we it's part of the human condition, I suppose. We just find a way through. Right? I've had moments where I've stepped away at times. I'm getting better at that, I suppose, of understanding what my limits and limitations are. There was probably a time a couple of years after Nikki's death where I was beyond burned out, but I kept going. And that was a time where there were multiple different submissions to both state and federal governments. There was a reform of the family court system. There was a reform of how victim survivors' families would give evidence during the court process. So there were so many things that felt so tangible and so significant that I just felt I had to keep going, even though I had no proverbial fuel in the tank. Now I'm much more balanced. Now if I need to, go and lie on a beach for 3 days, I'll do it. right? And I won't
Sure.
feel guilty about it. But there was a time where, you spoke about going to Spain. There's a time where I wouldn't have gone to Spain, and now I will gladly.
Yeah, well, I haven't experienced anything like what you're describing, but I think I felt the need to go and lie down for a while, and I can understand what you're saying there. But just a final point on this, I just wonder whether you felt there was any tensions or challenges in expressing your voice in this sort of space as a man. You know.
Oh yeah, definitely. And so much so that it's just something that I don't even think about as actively. And as in, Sandy, you're asking me the question now, and I'm like, oh, of course. Why didn't I mention that? I suppose one just gets better at over time of understanding what are the concerns where one should pause and self-reflect and evaluate and go, okay, I need to do something differently. And what are the situations where someone may be being antagonistic, or there may be other factors, and you think, okay, well, I really can't do anything. I've had experiences, over time where there've been issues, and I've sort of thought, should I be speaking on this? Should I not be speaking on this? And I'm always trying to be guided by some semblance of common sense, and also where someone else is better equipped to speak about something, I will gladly hand them the microphone. Right? There are things on which I know nothing, and certainly have no lived experience of. Right? So we'll hand them out. So, for example, I was once asked to speak on issues relating to Indigenous men, and I was quite frank. I said, I'm not an Indigenous man. I shouldn't be speaking on this. Here are 5 other men you can contact. I only know 2 of them personally, but the other 3's work I've seen, and
Yeah.
I think it speaks volumes. So please contact one of those people. I'm happy to reach out on your behalf, but I shouldn't be the one speaking. I've had other instances where, debates around trans identity and trans rights. I'm not the person to be speaking on certain things, right? I can have a view. I have, and I'll occasionally express them, and they're often, just broad support for and compassion for other people. But there are areas where I think it's important as a man to know your place and know your space,
Sure.
and to often endeavor to stand beside rather than in front of, or to speak over, particularly women, but generally anyone from a marginalized group.
So there's been a great deal of attention and public discussion about men's violence against women in Australia in the last year or so, after a series of appalling high-profile murders of women. And do you want to tell us about what impact you think these events have had? And do you think they've led to any change as yet, in your view?
Well, there's been a lot. We went from having a woman a week on average being killed to a woman every 4 to 5 days. The sort of frequency of these murders has resulted in more media attention, and I suppose more significant outrage, particularly from women and from feminist circles and feminist activist and advocacy groups. And I think what I suppose has happened as a result of the significance and frequency of these high-profile murders is that there is greater appetite than ever for change led by government. There's greater appetite for policymakers to be invested in solutions, to be doing things that require action now rather than a generational change. There was this sort of rhetoric a little less than a decade ago that it will take a generation to see meaningful change. And fortunately, through some very tragic loss of life, we've seen that people don't have the patience for that. So they're demanding more of public servants, of politicians, which I think is fantastic. And I think we're also seeing more men speaking up about this issue. I think that's been one of the consequences of the impact of the high-profile murders of women over the last year. But it's also, I think, a poignant reminder of how far we have to go. right? Of just how little progress we've made, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it is really um, difficult sometimes to be hopeful. We must, but it is very difficult to be hopeful when every 4 days, in a country that considers itself as progressive and developed and egalitarian as Australia, is in the midst of a crisis where gender inequality is on full show. Right? Forget the gender pay gap or flexible working arrangements. When women are being terrorized in their own homes, right, or are not able to leave a relationship freely without being physically harmed or murdered, then we've got a long way to go. Right, we've got a really really long way to go. So I think it's been heartening to see the level of community groundswell and action. There were significant sized rallies all of last year. There were activists who put the prime minister on notice to say we want you to do more, who made demands. But unfortunately, when it comes to meaningful policy action on this particular issue of men's violence against women, the government funding never quite matches the scale of the issue or the community need for funds. So for example, community legal centers will often say, we don't have enough to serve people beyond 3 months from today. Right. And so we can't make forward plans for 6 months or a year from now because we don't know how we're going to keep the lights on in 3 months' time. We don't know how we're going to open the door to victim survivors who come in during a time of crisis. And that is a really, really terrible thing in a country as wealthy as Australia, as financially wealthy as Australia, and as resource rich as Australia, that we are not able to do that. That tells me that there is something fundamentally wrong, and that we're lying to ourselves. We're not nearly as egalitarian as we think, if that's the reality and lived experience of far too many women in this country. And on the other side of that is that we're failing so many men. Right? How many men could realize their potential to be great men, but are resorting to learned behaviors or trauma responses that they're not proud of? Right? So we are fundamentally failing most of the population.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, I suppose, as you mentioned, like over the last decade, I guess Australia has, to some extent, been seen as, leading the way, perhaps compared to lots of other countries in terms of the kind of prevention work that's being done here, or that's attempted to be done around ending men's violence against women. But I think in the last year, perhaps there has been a bit of a kind of crisis of faith about this work, given the fact that clearly this is such a humongous issue still. And if anything, as you say, if anything seems to be getting worse in some ways, perhaps. So that has led to quite a lot of contention, I suppose, about, prevention work and what the right way forward is. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. What do you think about those debates? And is there anything in particular you would like to see being done, more in the kind of, in terms of prevention?
I think that one of the things about the recent debates around prevention work and the role of prevention is that we cannot pit aspects of the response for men's violence and the prevention of men's violence against one another. So funding for prevention and primary prevention should not be funding at the expense of early intervention. It should not be funding again, at the expense of men's behavior change and reform, or of rehabilitating, male perpetrators, or of supporting victim survivors, of providing safe refuge for women and children. And so, one of the things I would like to see fundamentally is a larger slice of the budgetary pie go towards the eradication and response to men's violence against women and men's violence more broadly, right? Because that would require addressing so many aspects of society. It would require addressing issues around the gender pay gap. It would require addressing issues around men's mental health and well-being. It would require addressing issues around gambling and alcohol and drug reform, etc. It would actually encompass so many things. So rather than pitting everything against each other as a zero-sum game and saying we can't afford it, right? It would require a rethink of how we actually attribute and distribute funds in Australia. I always think it's interesting how, and particularly in the lead up to the election, we'll see all the election promises. We're going to spend X amount of money. And one of the things that's always confused me about that is that in any other sector, and particularly in the private sector, if one were to say, I'm going to spend X amount of money, no one's clapping and applauding that. They're asking, what is the result that you're going to guarantee? What is the outcome for investors or shareholders or stakeholders or beneficiaries? What do you promise the community or the interested parties that you will deliver? And I suppose one of the things about Australian politicians is that they're very quick to make funding announcements, right? They're very quick to go to ribbon cutting ceremonies or to build a new facility. But the actual arduous work of primary prevention in particular, it's not very sexy. It's long and slow, and it's a grind. And anyone who works in the space will tell you that, right? That it is largely a thankless job, but it is significant and it is crucial. And so funding can't be taken from one area and then put in another one because things aren't happening quick enough. It actually, to me, says that we need to be doing more of both, right? But unfortunately, the politicization of a lot of these issues, the very politicization of concepts of masculinity and manhood and gender equality, rather than being an aspirational ideal for society to strive to, but it being a political, point scoring ground, makes it really, really complicated for people to affect change. It makes it really complicated, I think, as well for everyday people to feel invested, right? Because politicians will fight about these terms, right? We saw in the lead up to the US election, the way that ideas of what being a man were weaponized by people on the right to, mean a certain thing, to then create an environment where if you were a real man, you would vote for Trump because that's what real men do. Right. And I wonder whether we're going to see that play out in Australian context as well in the lead up to a federal election.
Well, I wanted to ask you about exactly that, actually. Yeah, I mean, so Australia will be having a federal election in the next few months. And do you think that we are already seeing kind of gender play out in how the politicians are kind of positioning themselves? And do you think that that's affecting debates around issues like gender equality?
I think so. I think we've seen, for example, it play out over a protracted period of time. So I can't remember whether it was a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, there was a news article where they interviewed Peter Dutton's wife, where she spoke about how he's not a monster, right? And the headline was "Not a Monster." And that was in response to, news coverage and opinion pieces that he didn't have the right level of empathy or emotional intelligence and other attributes that are becoming more important for leaders to possess. And so, or to demonstrate whether they possess them or not. And so what's really, really interesting is that this has played out, I think, over a period of time, but now coming up to, an imminent election in Australia, I think that there is this idea of, especially after the election of President Donald Trump in the United States, what type of leader is the right leader for a country like Australia? And ideas of manhood and masculinity are really coming to the fore. So we're seeing, for example, criticism of Adam Bandt, because leader of the Greens, because of the way he displays certain aspects of masculinity. We're seeing criticism of Anthony Albanese, current Prime Minister, because of how he displays certain ideas of masculinity. And so and Peter Dutton similarly. So masculinity has become this almost like fertile ground now for arguments about what type of leader is appropriate and then what masculine attributes do they have, right? Which is really, really fascinating, of course. But it's also potentially quite detrimental because you now have a lot of people talking about masculinity and manhood rather than talking about what are the human attributes that we want leaders to have, right? And rather than striving towards any kind of gender equality and breaking down some of these rigid ideas of manhood and masculinity, seeing who can fit into them in the most perfect way, and then deciding that they're the most appropriate person to lead a country, which is unfortunately not probably the best approach.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I feel like the idea that our leaders need to be tough, right, and strong. And I feel like in Australia, in recent times, there's been a lot of emphasis on being tough on crime, like clamping down on youth crime and things like that. And it may be violence against women is being used in that way, maybe, for example, by Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, that he wants to be tough on that, and that can be a way to prove he is this, big, strong leader.
It's sort of something that the Liberal National Coalition, they've certainly done it in state elections. They've used this tough on crime approach. And oddly, they've only addressed crime in certain communities when doing so. So, for example, communities that have a higher proportion of South Sudanese migrants or more recent Afghani migrants, and the quite sad reality is that men's violence occurs across all, socio cultural and ethnic groups. It may manifest differently, sure, right? But it's not like certain communities have this immunity pin from, committing and perpetrating or experiencing it. Right, its detrimental impacts are felt across all communities, and I think one of the things, you were asking me earlier about the high-profile murders of the last year. One of the things that, when a woman in a particular community is murdered, it can sometimes send shockwaves through all of society, because we start to think, oh my God, it doesn't happen to people like that. But the reality is it does, and it can. And so when it does happen, it creates a groundswell for action. And so one of the most powerful things when it occurs in communities where there are people from, the middle class or upper middle class, is that sometimes they have the resources and the clout to be heard and to be seen. And when those people use that clout to be heard and seen and give voice to the women from their communities whose lives are stolen, I think is a very profound and powerful thing, because people listen. Sadly, not all victims are seen as equal, and certainly not all perpetrators are seen as equal. And I think, we do see that weaponizing of ideas of race and cultural identity. Just last week, during International Women's Day, or maybe it was the week before, I remember someone asked me about how we can prevent escalating rates of men's violence when there are men from more culturally diverse communities in Australia now. It's a very racially loaded question, right? And I don't know this particular individual's experience. They could have been the victim of men's violence at the hands of someone from a culturally and racially marginalized group, which of course is going to color one's judgment, right? Of course, but the hard thing there is having to reconcile that one person's negative experience does not amount to an evidentiary basis upon which to discriminate against any particular group, right? And so we have to be quite bold in standing up against racism or transphobia or certain ideas that discriminate against particular groups because they create a fear, like that men from, say, South Asia are here to attack white Australian women. It's not true. There's no evidentiary basis for that point of view. But we have to, and so we have to be very careful in how we have these discussions, and not allow, I think, too much oxygen for them to actually be ventilated, right? Because I think they're often used as a distraction from addressing the real issue, which is that there are power structures which benefit a very small subset of men at the expense of most others, including a lot of men.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, in your work, you're a commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission, aren't you? And I was thinking, just relating to what you were just saying, that actually, very recently, and again, this relates to the US, equality and diversity initiatives, they've been increasingly experiencing some pushback. And I'm wondering whether is that also a debate that's happening in Australia as well, and does it concern you?
It does. And I think what concerns me is the importation of what's been called like the culture wars from the United States into Australian public discourse, right? Australia is thankfully a very different society to the United States, right? We, for example, we don't have access to guns, which is a wonderful thing, right? We have many different checks and balances. We have for all of its failures, we have a Medicare system that by and large works such that, people that require emergency care overwhelmingly will be treated with emergency care. And the most expensive thing for them is the parking ticket for their family in the hospital, right? Everything else is sort of paid for. And so there's many wonderful things about Australia. And I think what's happening now is the divisive nature of the diversity, equity, and inclusion debates in the United States is coming here, and it's coming to the fore when I don't think it's necessarily as prevalent here as it is in the United States. And, I hope I'm correct. I hope I'm not wrong. I hope that what I'm saying is not, with the passing of time, going to be shown to be abundantly untrue, because that would mean that we are in a worse off position in Australia than I would like to think, which is that we are far more similar to the United States, where people are so divided along political lines that they're unable to see the humanity of the person opposing them, right? We have to find common ground. We have to find common ground in what it is that we seek. Australia has a lot of benefits in that European settlement is quite recent, right? In the scheme of things, if we contrast ourselves to the United Kingdom or to other parts of the world, we don't have, successive waves of issues like other countries have had for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And so we've got a lot of potential here, and I think we need not be distracted too much by some of the debates from elsewhere. But I think what's happening here is that we're getting very drawn into them, right? We're getting them. We're getting so drawn into them that we're speaking about them as though they're not happening over there, but they're happening right here in our backyard. But I think there's still more that unites us in Australia than divides us, and we have to hold on to that quite dear. Because without it, I think we're not actually going to be able to do the necessary work to have better outcomes for the majority of the Australian population.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess I mentioned at the start the sort of legacy of colonialism and, British responsibility. But whilst you're talking, I'm thinking about also, Australia's had quite a punitive approach to asylum seekers, to refugees for a long time, before... I mean, you were outsourcing refugees to islands like Nauru, and actually that debate has come the other way. So in recent times in the UK, we were talking about sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, and other countries have talked about that. That's kind of gone off the agenda with a new government, but there has been this sense of an Australian model around that particular issue.
Oh, we are a fundamentally flawed country here in Australia, and deeply racist. Like deep, our very foundations, of colonization and settlement, and the whole reason I think, Stephen, that you so profoundly spoke about the acknowledgement of country is because of how messed up our quite recent past is, and even current. We're having this conversation around men's violence broadly and around gender equality. The outcomes for Aboriginal women and children, and Aboriginal men as well, are terrible, right? As compared to the mainstream population. They're absolutely atrocious. And if we're going to talk about racism for any group, we have to talk about racism for First Nations people, right? Because they have been dispossessed of their land and then robbed of their very dignity throughout. And it wasn't that long ago. I think we think about colonialism like it happened so long ago. It wasn't that long ago, and so it's something that we have to reckon with, and I think it's something that we have to be able to have more conversations about. And for those of us who are settlers on this land, such as myself, Stephen, and whoever else is, those listening from Australia, I think it's our responsibility to shut up as well and listen. Listen to First Nations people and support their right towards self-determination and sit in the discomfort, right? And I think that, unfortunately, political leadership in Australia is so fundamentally lacking when it comes to this issue. We had the election of Anthony Albanese on the basis, in part, of the voice and a referendum, and after that failed, any conversation around this issue was just quelled into a dumb silence. And I thought that was really unfortunate, because if anything, I think political leaders of yore would have said, okay, we're going to have this difficult conversation. And I suppose the thing that I feel most strongly about Australia and so many countries now is the sheer pathetic nature of our political leaders. Sorry to be a downer, but that's you've caught me at a time where that's how I feel. I think that it's quite depressing.
Well, perhaps I'll try and end on a little bit more of a hopeful note. I was wondering what you've just said about racism. How do you think that should be informing our efforts to engage with boys and men? So, for example, in conversations about the manosphere, the backlash against gender equality. We often do talk about men and boys as if they're this monolithic group, right? But obviously there will be many experiences of racism, for example, among that group, and vice versa. Obviously, lots of boys and men, myself included, have a lot of privilege because of our whiteness, for example. So, I was just wondering if, how can an awareness of racism and its impacts help us to reach boys and men in more meaningful ways, I suppose, do you think?
Well, listen up, two white men. Here is a man of color about to tell. No, it's so interesting that you asked that. It seems to be the thing I cannot stop talking about, which is that we can't continue to look at men and boys as, you said, a monolith, right? We have made significant progress with so far to go for women and girls because we've understood that not all women and girls are the same. And we need to bring some of that approach, that idea of equitable thinking, to men and boys. Men from lower socioeconomic groups who are living, who are working in precarious working arrangements, who do not have access to safe or flexible working conditions, who are from migrant and refugee backgrounds, are treated differently in society. And so if we lump all boys and men together and say, we need to engage all boys and men, without understanding what the lived experience is for certain segments of the male population, we will, it's like we will be banging our heads against the wall. We will not meaningfully engage with them because we're not actually addressing them. We're addressing some arbitrary idea of what it means to be a man, right? And I think we have to become more aware of class when it comes to our engagement with boys and men. And we also have to become aware of race. Because I think these two factors are so significant. And I think these two factors are ones that enable boys and men to become more invested in gender equality. Because when we engage with boys and men in a way that's meaningful to them, we acknowledge their, ethno-cultural pressures or upbringing or understanding, or we acknowledge that they have to work doubly, triply hard to put food on the table for their family, that being a provider is not just an idea of adherence to rigid gender norms, but it is a way that they show, for example, affection towards the women and the kin in their family unit. That we have to actually unpack these things with somewhat of a more humanist approach and a bit more understanding about the lived experience and realities of different men. The ones who we're talking about when we say boys and men are in the 1%. They're the people who are white, cisgender, able-bodied men who have significant financial capital or access to financial capital and clout as a consequence of that, right? And those aspects of race and class, they have to be present. If an understanding of men and masculinities that is devoid of intersectionality will fail, unfortunately. And so it doesn't have to be difficult or complicated to acknowledge racism or other aspects of class or intersectionality with boys and men. But unfortunately, it isn't happening, right? And if it's not happening at all, it's going to get more difficult with time because the people we want to engage will get further disenfranchised because they won't feel seen or heard. And I don't say this because I think we need to pander to people, but I think that we need to see the humanity in other people in order for us to be able to engage with them. Right. And I think we're seeing that play out in sort of media representations of violence in Australia at the moment. The way that, in particular, Arab men are framed in the media in Australia, especially with the ongoing war in Gaza and the circumstances for people in Gaza and surrounds, is such that Arab men are seen as being somehow inherently violent or lacking in care and compassion. And these things couldn't be further from the truth. They're fundamentally untrue. But we were talking about media representations earlier, and that is fueling this idea. And we have to grapple with racism at an institutional, structural level, as well as a micro level, in order to actually meaningfully engage with boys and men. And I think when we do, one of the benefits, I think, we're trying to end this conversation, hopefully, I think one of the benefits, forgetting all of the positive things for women and girls, will be the profound benefits for boys and men, right? We've had such significant change in the last 150 years. The very role of what it means to be a man has fundamentally shifted and altered. And in some ways, that has been very complicated and very difficult for men who were never seen much anyway, men from particular class groups or backgrounds. And for those people, men from, working class backgrounds, men from culturally and racially marginalized groups, for them to be seen and to be heard and to feel involved will have profound benefits for their communities. Or we can dream, we can hope, and we try and we persevere. But it seems like we're living in a political climate where in the West it feels harder than ever to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Tarang. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice nuance, but hopefully still hopeful message to end on. And I mean, the work you're doing as well, I think, gives me hope. People like you, it's amazing what you're doing. So thank you again, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks from me too as well. I mean, it's been very powerful listening to you, and I'm sure it'll be great for our listeners to hear too.
No, thank you so much, Sandy and Stephen, for having me on your podcast, Now and Men. I think this is such a wonderful concept, and I joked to Stephen earlier that we live in a world where a lot of men will decide that they need to have a podcast, right? It's almost like a birthright or a rite of passage into manhood, and yet this is one of the ones that I think should exist and should be, amplified more. So. If you're a first-time listener and you're listening because I've shared this on social media, go back and listen to the archive, right? Go listen to all the other brilliant and far more, wonderful voices. You learn something, right? And I think it's wonderful. And thank you both for having me on. I genuinely appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
That's so kind of you. Thank you. Well, Sandy, I thought they were some really good and important points at the end there by Tarang about, I suppose, when we're trying to engage with boys and men about issues of gender equality and violence against women, to kind of recognise, men's complex lives and positions, and the fact that obviously, lots and lots of boys and men will not be feeling very powerful and will actually have their own experiences of racism or oppression or marginalisation. And I guess, that we really need to be taking that into account and being able to have those kind of nuanced conversations. And actually, that, as Tarang said, that can actually a route into those conversations with boys and men as well, that relating to them about their own experiences of marginalisation. And also, I think there are links as well, of course, between, as Tarang was saying, between things like sexism and misogyny, and then also things like racism, right? And I suppose how we need to address them simultaneously, especially in a country like Australia, where there is such a significant history of racism and oppression there that Tarang talked about. And I do think, how can we think creatively about how we could be simultaneously addressing these different issues in like educative and kind of meaningful conversations, especially at a time when obviously, work around equity and diversity is being attacked more than ever.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess, his own sort of personal story or journey reflects some of this stuff. But I found it incredibly impressive how he's, experienced so much and yet come through it and can talk so impressively about these issues, you know. I mean, it was very, very sort of informed and sensitive and sophisticated in the way he was talking. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to pick out was when we were talking about, the issues around tough on crime, and how significant that discourse often is. I mean, I was thinking as he was talking about, Tony Blair in the UK saying, we need to focus on be tough on crime, but also tough on the causes of crime. That was one of his little early catchphrases. I don't think we did so well on the causes of crime part of it. And so often now, we hear people talk about and enact punitive responses to crime, when actually, from my perspective, we should be thinking about not just what's tough, but what's effective. What is the most likely approach that's going to reduce crime? And very often it's not, banging people up in highly expensive institutions for increasing numbers of years, whilst at the same time you recognise the seriousness of what people have sometimes, and men have sometimes done. So, and I guess all that tough discourse, it also reflects in politics as well, doesn't it? I'm struck by the horrific reality of the way that some politicians are talking now about being strong, being tough, and what kind of masculinity are they now modelling to young men? And, you know, to what extent could there be a link between public discourse and you know, private behaviour, actually? You know, is that affecting negatively?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely something you're seeing a lot here in Australia, is that, especially from the kind of conservative side, you know, but also I think the Labour Party, you know, here is feeling the need to go along with these tough on crime discourses. And I think it is very gendered, isn't it? I think it is a way of leaders trying to show that they're tough and they're strong men, or, you know, strong leaders, that they can be macho in that way. In Australia, especially, it's been around youth crime. Even though actually in many contexts youth crime is going down, there's been more and more of a kind of focus on it. And I suppose the media is putting a lot of kind of pressure on politicians in that regard as well. But as you said, it's things like trying to lower the age of criminal responsibility and things like that. So basically trying to send young people and children to prison, you know, which, as you said, like it's just in no way going to work, even if we just want to reduce crime. You know, if anything, it's going to make it harder for them to get out of the difficult situation they might be in. And I think it's important to highlight as well that it's disproportionately First Nations children as well who end up going to prison and being punished, which takes us back to the beginnings of our conversation here. And something I wanted to say as well, I suppose, is just that as a British person, you know, who's obviously recently moved and settled here in Australia myself, yeah, it's really forced me to come to terms in a much more like in-your-face way, I suppose, with the impact that British colonialism has had and continues to have. You know, the massively, you know, as Tarang said, how we have destroyed communities and cultures who are continuing to deal with the loss and the trauma of that. And it's just not something we're really talking about in the UK very much, is it? Like, it's not so, you know, like, for example, the impact of British imperialism here in Australia is just not something you really learn about. And obviously it's happened in many places across the globe.
Well, and I mean, you could say that in a way it is contested, in the sense that, you know, there are quite a few people wandering around saying, oh, well, the British Empire wasn't nearly as bad as we thought it was. Yeah. And maybe we could reclaim some of this sort of, in inverted commas, greatness. Yeah. You know, that's part of the discourse from the right. And it was part of the Brexit discussion on some level. Yeah. You know, there are people who genuinely believe this stuff. So, I think that's probably enough for today, isn't it?
Yes, I think for today, however, we've probably said enough. Yes, but thank you so much, everybody, for listening. As always, do subscribe to Now Men if you haven't done so already, and share it with your friends and colleagues. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
Bye for now.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.